Welcome back, everybody. In today's video, I buy the smallest, quirkiest, weirdest Montero I could possibly find. Let me introduce you to my new Pajero Mini. So this is it, my new to me 1995 Pajero Mini. And a lot of you guys have never seen this if you've been in the United States because we never got them here. This is a K car. And so what that means is it's a classification of car in Japan where they get a break on taxes and registration and all this stuff because they're so small. So this is just like a Montero, but it's shrunk way down to fit those requirements. And I got it from a guy who got it from an importer who brought it into the United States. So this is 1995. So these just recently became something you could actually import because of our import laws. But I am so excited that it's here now because I get to drive this quirky little thing on our massive American roads. So without further ado, let me take you on a tour of this thing. Let me show you all of its weird quirks, all the weird stuff that came with this K car and why I'm so excited about it. So the first thing we have to talk about with a K car, especially in the United States, is the size. This thing is 55 inches wide. It's less than 6 feet, which is so tiny. It takes up about half of a lane on our roads. So it's really tiny, it's really short. I think the roof line is below 5 feet. And so compared to a lot of the rest of the Monteros, especially mine, that's really short. And it's less than 10 feet tip to tail. So it's not a very big car. It actually feels normal on the road, but when you get out and you look at it, it's so small. One of the other things that makes it a K car is what's going on underneath the hood. And we'll talk about that in a second. But let me take you around the body. Let me show you some of the things that came with its stock, some of the modifications or factory options that have been added to it, and give you a tour of the exterior of this thing before we jump under the hood. So starting up here in the front, you can see this cute little grille, and this thing just looks awesome to me. It looks like a toy. It doesn't look like a real functional car, and this plastic has actually held up pretty well over the years. You figure this thing's almost 30 years old. Comes with the round glass style headlights, and then it's got these fog lights built in from the factory, and these aren't some cheap throw on afterward, like it'll rattle around thing. This whole thing is really solid. This bull bar or whatever it would be used for is actually pretty solid. And these fog lights are pretty bright too. It's got these indicators down here, and then it's got this little bumper. Now, I'm not 100% sure this would do a whole lot of good for you. It is solid, but look at this skid plate in the front. This is aluminum, and it's a decent thickness right there. It's at least 1/8 of an inch thick. It goes all the way down here, so it protects all your valuables like your sump and your diff. And it's got some pretty decent brackets on it too. So that's a pretty nice feature, which is helpful because it's only about 7 inches off the ground, which actually isn't too bad for this car. But I imagine if I take it off-road, or rather when I take it off-road, I might be making use of that. Around this side, you get these weird looking slider things, and these are definitely not structural. I wouldn't jack the car up on this, but as you can tell, they have a little bit of protection for this lower rocker panel. I don't love that they're chrome, but it's kind of fun that they're there. They look a little tough, and they're kind of unique, and they're actually pretty solid. I would definitely trust them to take at least one rock hit before giving out on me, but that's kind of a fun feature as well. Now, the previous owner of this did throw on bigger wheels and tires, and so they do have a little bit of an offset, and they sit pretty wide. However, it turns them pretty well, and this adds a lot of stability side to side because this thing is so narrow, especially when you get it off-road. It seems like it would be really tippy. Now, I did get the factory wheels, and my plan is to maybe put them on at some point if I can find tires for them. But in the meantime, I'm actually kind of enjoying this stance. It makes it just look even more ridiculous that it's such a small car with such a big presence for what it is. And even though those tires and wheels are wide, it's not even close to a normal car. One of the things you'll notice right away with this is it is right-hand drive, just like it would be normal in Japan. So everything is on this side, not on the other side where I tend to get in because I'm just used to the muscle memory of getting in on that side. The amount of times I found myself jumping in the passenger seat and having to scoot over to the driver's seat is pretty hilarious. But it is right-hand drive. This is my first right-hand drive car, and it's stick shift too, so I have to learn all about that. Other unique Japanese features include this side mirror, which at this point in America, this is pretty pointless. This is used for parallel parking so that you can find the edge of the curb. But because I'm going to be parking on the other side, because it's right-hand drive and I drive on the other side of the road, this mirror is totally pointless, but it's kind of a fun quirk to have. Now, if you're familiar with other Montero or Pajero or even Shogun platforms, you will find all sorts of things on this that are Montero adjacent. So it's got a lot of similar things, a lot of similar design structures. It really does feel like a Montero that's just been shrunk down. So this is the two-door version. And so you've got a door in the front, obviously a door on the passenger side, but then you have this swinging hatch just like every other Montero. The door opens the same way. Even the back glass is the same profile. Things like the hinges are the same kind. The lights attached the same way. It's got a very similar profile, a very similar design to the other Monteros. There's a couple things that are unique about it. Because of the small size, this spare tire actually has a pretty good indent into the bumper here. So it has to fit just right in this spot. And I was looking at mounting a different tire here, but there just is not a lot of clearance in there. But it's fun to see basically all of the same design features of a Montero just shrunken down to fit in this K car. So I mentioned the dimensions earlier, and it's 10 feet tip to tail, but check out this departure angle. I mean, we're talking maybe 6 inches, maybe even less, between the rear tire and the back of the vehicle. So when you sit in this thing, you're actually sitting so far back in it, there's almost nothing outside of the wheelbase. In the front, you have another maybe 6 inches, and then because of the wide wheels and tires, the tires are really the 4 corners of the vehicle. It just makes for a really interesting driving experience. It feels, like everyone will say, like a go-kart on the road. A few other things that came with this that I can only assume are factory are these Mitsubishi rain guards or wind guards right here. And these things actually are in pretty good shape. I'm not a huge fan of these. I do like that these ones are clear because I can see through them and that helps, but these are kind of a fun option. So the other thing that I mentioned makes it a K car is the engine size. So you can see right here, this is an intercooled turbo double overhead cam 20 valve. This is the VR2 model. So let's pop the hood and I'll show you what's going on under there. So here it is, the mighty double overhead cam 20 valve turbocharged intercooled motor. And this thing, although all of those numbers are intriguing and would scream power, this thing is completely gutless. And that's mostly because this is a K car, and that means that the engine displacement, the actual cubic centimeters of this engine, cannot exceed 660 cc's. So this thing has almost no displacement in it, and yet it is a 4-cylinder and it's turbocharged. So the rules with K cars in Japan is it has to have a certain engine size. That's how you get away. So it has to be a certain size and it has to be a certain displacement. And that's how you get away with that K designation. And that gets you that break on taxes and registration and stuff. And so in order to make as much power as possible, they have a really small motor with as much performance thrown into it as they possibly can. And it's still really slow, especially by American standards. But let me give you a tour of this motor. This is one of the things that's the most different from the other Monteros that we got in the United States. We never got a turbocharged version, and we never got something in this kind of configuration at all. So this is a completely different motor. It's not like a Montero motor, but shrunk down. This is a completely different beast. Now, as you can tell, this one's been super well cared for, and the previous owner has gone through and done silicone lines everywhere. He actually detailed this engine bay for me, cleaned it all up, and it's in really good shape. The first thing you notice right off the bat with this motor is that it has an intercooler, and the intercooler is pretty massive for what it is. It doesn't really do a ton, but it's very impressive, and it's fed by this functional hood scoop. So that hood scoop actually pushes air into this. How efficient is it? I have no idea, but it's really fun to have a functional hood scoop on this car. Over on the passenger side, you can see this itty bitty turbo. I mean, it is so small. That's my hand for comparison. I mean, I could hold the whole thing in my hand. It's really, really tiny. I do wish it made a little more noise. It's got the stock airbox and stock exhaust on it, and so and stock blow-off valve, and so it'd be fun to modify that to make just a little more noise, even though it won't go faster. But anyways, that's where the turbo is, and that feeds this intercooler, which then goes in here, and it is EFI. So that's really nice. Given that it's 1995, I wouldn't expect any different, but sometimes you get a motor this size, it's functionally a motorcycle sized motor. You expect it to stick with carburetor, but not this one. This one's EFI. And I also mentioned that it's a 20 valve, so it has 5 valves per cylinder, and I've heard the valves are about that big. They cannot be that big. This thing is so small. But there's the motor. This thing's in great shape, and it functions pretty well. The funny thing about it, though, is you have to drive it like a motorcycle. So if you're used to your bigger American cars with lots of torque, with lots of power that don't get above 5,000 RPM, not this one. This redlines at 8,000 RPM, and you will use every bit of that tachometer when you're trying to drive this around just to keep up with traffic and make it through town. Now, I mentioned that this shares a lot of the design language and a lot of the features from other Monteros, and that's actually true underneath as well. So I was actually able to put this up on a lift and check some of the things out. Let me give you a tour underneath the car. So jumping underneath the car, you can see a few things. First, here's a good undershot of that skid plate and the front bumper. And it is pretty massive, and it would do a good job of protecting you off-road if you really needed it to. So I'm pretty thrilled about that. And then here's what it looks like underneath. The first thing you'll notice is this is a unibody construction. And so that's a little different than the Monteros of this generation. They didn't have unibody constructions in the Gen 3 Monteros until 2001. That's when they came out, but it makes sense for this car. However, this one does have a solid axle in the rear, which is pretty fun. And it has a similar trailing arm setup to the Gen 2s that were coming out at the time. Up front, it does have rack and pinion steering, which makes it a lot nicer to drive on the road. It is independent suspension, but instead of using a traditional A-arm, it's got a McPherson strut that goes down into the spindle, which is how a lot of passenger cars are made, and I'm sure it's plenty strong. This front diff is actually very similar to a lot of Monteros. It's got a vacuum actuated disconnect, but the thing that's really different is as a divorced transfer case. That means the transfer case has a drive shaft between the end of the transmission and the actual transfer case. Here you see the fuel tank. It's really small. I think it's got a 10-gallon capacity, and I'm really curious to see what the fuel mileage is like. And then here's a shot of those sliders, if you can even call them sliders. You can see how they're kind of mounted up, and you can see there's a little bit of rust on here. Really not a big deal. Very common for a car coming out of Japan. All right, now jumping inside the vehicle, we're on the driver's side. And this is what it looks like in the Pajero Mini. It is pretty sparse in here, and I wouldn't expect anything else. So here's what you're looking at from the driver's seat. Mitsubishi steering wheel, love that it has the logo on it. I just think that's so quirky. And then you have your dashboard. Like I said, there's that red line. 8,000 RPM is where it wants to max out at. And when you're cruising, you're somewhere between 4 and 5 pretty regularly. So you just got to get used to the revs. It drives and rides a lot more like a motorcycle than it does a car. Obviously, you've got this in kilometers right here. This says just under 80,000 kilometers. And so it hasn't driven very far. But I mean, how could you take this car very far? And then I got all your warning lights and all that stuff. It does have a switch for the fog lights, and those actually work pretty well. They're definitely a fun, functional feature, and so that's kind of tucked over here. One of the things I'm getting used to with right-hand drive is all of these controls are backwards for me. So this is my turn signal, and this is my wipers. And the amount of times I'm trying to merge into traffic and I turn on my wipers, I still have not gotten used to it. So that's a fun quirk for me to kind of learn. And hopefully by the end of my time with this car, I'll be a lot better at it. Now, unfortunately, this info system doesn't actually work. Apparently, it's been baked in the sun, and so the LEDs behind it or the lights, they're just fried. And so I can kind of barely see it at night, but half of these things aren't functioning. So I might need to replace this. It's kind of a bummer that it doesn't work because it's so quirky. You've got your regular HVAC controls, and it does have AC, although it does rob you of horsepower. And then the previous owner threw in this American head unit so that you can actually pick up radio signal in the US. And then it's got these fun cup holders that a lot of 90s cars came with. Other than that, it's pretty simple. It is a stick shift. It's a 5-speed, so that's really fun. and it has a real transfer case. Like I mentioned underneath, it's got real 2 high, 4 high, and 4 low. And I'm super excited to take this out and test it out off-road. And then it's got a manual parking brake, which is fun. And that's pretty much it. These cloth seats are fun, but it's very sparse in here. It has a glove box, a grab handle, no real frills on the doors, except for it does have automatic windows. So that's kind of fun. Now I've got to go wide angle here in the back to show you the rest of it. This is the back seat, and as you can see, there's no room for any actual person in here, but it does have a back seat and 2 seat belts. So theoretically, you could roll 4 deep in this thing. I imagine maybe you could put a car seat back there, but I don't know if you'd want to. It does have cup holders, however, and speakers for your rear passengers. Honestly, I just think that's hilarious, but it does have room if the people that you want to carry have really, really tiny legs. In the trunk of the Pajero Mini, you get to see, again, those back seats, and you can see, yeah, not a lot of room back here. It does have room, but not a lot. It's got these little guys right here, and that actually allows you to adjust things, which will be helpful for me because I want to store some stuff back here as I journey in this thing. But you can fold those forward, and then once you do, there's a decent amount of trunk space. I mean, obviously there's nothing between the driver's side and the trunk, but there's some room for storage here. You could do some grocery runs in this. You can haul some bins of things. There's a decent amount of room. Then under here, you have a little storage compartment, and I love this, just hidden in the floor. It's a good use of space. You can see the Japanese were really thinking about how to maximize the practicality of this vehicle. And I've got all sorts of extra parts from the previous owner, some oil filters, a Japanese road flare, which I'm sure doesn't work anymore because it's almost 30 years old, but what a cool thing to get with it. I've got some belts and oil filters and air filters, and so I'm pretty prepared there. But this is all the space you get in this thing. Another thing on the exterior that's really tripping me out is this door is actually a normal sized door. Like when you open it up, this is the normal size door out of basically a normal Pajero or a normal Montero, but it's on this small car. And so when you look at it, it looks really, really small all the way up until you try to get inside of it. And then once you get inside, you've got plenty of leg room. The door feels normal. If you're just in here, right in this spot, other than being pretty close to the passenger in the car, this feels like a totally normal vehicle. The windshield is pretty high. The door is a normal size. I have a decent amount of leg room. It's kind of hilarious. You don't feel like you're in a really small car until you get out and you get around other cars, or you get out and you just look at it. Then you realize, wow, this thing is tiny. So there it is, guys. This is my 1995 Pajero Mini, and I am so excited to add this to my collection. It's going to be so quirky. It's so weird. I just feel like it's awesome that I was able to get this because it's so different than anything else I have. It's so different than anything else on the roads in the United States. I'm getting so many comments. People are so excited to see this. And so I hope you guys are intrigued by it. This is a whole new segment for me. So I'm sure that there's some people who are like Pajero Mini nerds, and you guys know everything there is to know about this. I'm going to learn it as I go. I'm just thrilled to have such a quirky car. So with that said, I'm going to go on a massive, and I'm talking massive adventure with this thing. I'm currently in Phoenix, Arizona, which if you're new to the channel, that's not where I live. I live in Bozeman, Montana. That's a lot of miles from here. It's literally across the country. And I'm going to be driving this Pajero Mini all the way back home. So I'm gonna take it on all sorts of adventures. I'm gonna go to some cool, iconic places on the way. And if you're interested in figuring out, will this thing make it back to Montana, which I'm interested to figure out, go ahead and subscribe. Join me on the journey. I'm gonna be going to SEMA. I'm gonna be going to Flagstaff. I'm gonna be visiting other Montero nerds. I'm gonna take it off-road in Moab. It's gonna be an epic adventure. So anyways, if you wanna join me on that, go ahead and subscribe and follow along as I road trip this Pajero Mini across the country. All right, guys, thanks for joining me on this. I'll catch you on the next one.